Okay, here we are with Mayor John Bauters of Emeryville. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I learned about you through social media. You have very vibrant social and active social media accounts where you're often highlighting mobility issues. I absolutely love them. I think I immediately came across a video of you crossing an overpass, walking over an overpass, and I just started following all of the posts. So much attention on mobility issues, but of course also broader issues related to the community. So my first question I want to ask, in your role as a mayor and in your use of social media, what is your sort of agenda in highlighting mobility issues, but also other issues affecting the community?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would say on my agenda, I get asked that question a lot. What's your bike agenda? What's your pedestrian agenda? My agenda is joy. That's how I capture it. My agenda is joy. I want to show people that all the things that we were talking about, safe spaces for movement, access to people of all ages and abilities, the opportunity to be outside. My line is go outside, right? That all those things are associated with joy and happiness. And so my agenda, while it has a lot of very obvious components to it about making spaces more people oriented, is really about helping people find joy in their life in urban settings. Yeah.
I love that because this concept of a livable city and a happy city and a joyful city, there's so many, if we're looking at it from the perspective of municipal decision makers making decisions or urban planners, there's so much technicalities, but as a citizen, you know in your bones when you're in a city that's joyful, or in a city you have that lived experience of I enjoy going out in my city and running my errands. It's not a drag. So that's really great. So another thing, the mayorship is not, I just want to get this addressed in the beginning. You are a true public servant. The mayorship is not your full-time job. So I want to ask about also your full-time job.
Yeah, my full-time job. So currently I'm the state director for a nonprofit at the Alliance for Safety and Justice. And I do advocacy around creating safe spaces and doing legislative reform and financing for survivors of violent crime. So programs and policies that elevate the voice of survivors of crime, people who've lost loved ones who have been survivors of domestic or sexual assault. And I help redirect state funding to reprioritize and recenter around those voices, holistic care and treatment.
Okay, so that's your very commendable full-time work. And then the mayorship is your public servant role.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and you were explaining this to me before we started recording. The way it works is you're on city council and you've been on city council for 6 years, and you're in your second term of mayorship, and then in the next term you nominate somebody else. That's how it functions in Emeryville.
Yeah. So the council selects a mayor from among ourselves to from among the council, we select somebody to serve as the mayor. And this is my second time around. The council has selected me to be the mayor of the city. Yeah.
And I have to ask, what do you love about being a mayor?
I love people. I love the opportunity to, I mean, I don't have to be the mayor to be connected with people. That's not something that's like reserved for mayors. But when you're in the position of mayor, there's a lot of people who are reaching out to you because they want to talk to the mayor about things going on in the city. They feel like that's the person who is representing the people at the highest level of local government. And I really delight in the opportunity to engage with folks, hear from folks, solve their problems. I'm a problem solving personality. And so for me, when people come to me with ideas or challenges or issues, I really delight in being the person who helps solve their problem.
So I mean, you're really like the perfect person to be a public servant to create a people-oriented city. And I understand there's been a lot of changes that have happened under your term. So this idea of creating a people-oriented city, you were sharing with me about the holistic approach. So would love to hear what this means, creating a holistic approach to a people-oriented city in Emeryville.
Yes, it's a really important thing to discuss. So it's easy to get focused on elements of people orientedness, but not see kind of the bigger, more holistic picture, and recognizing how different policies from different areas of life and social engagement all create people oriented cities that really do support a more livable and walkable community. So when I say that, it's, you know, a lot of people will see, you know, in social media posts that I talk a lot about walkability and bikeability and infrastructure changes, right? And those are obviously really key components to recentering community space around people and away from things like cars and other things that are taking away from the opportunity for people to engage. But beyond that, there's other things that you need, right? So housing policy is a huge component of people-oriented cities, making sure housing is dense enough, it's healthy enough, that it is affordable and it's accessible to people, that we don't displace community members who've been here for a long period of time, that we do placekeeping with housing. There are a lot of policies that our city has undertaken. We've passed a $50 million affordable housing bond to ensure that we build housing for people of all socioeconomic levels as we continue to develop our city. We prioritize housing's nexus with transportation so that people have choices when they come here, because part of being people oriented is also, again, removing the opportunity for other things to be in the space that people can be in. But then there's a suite of additional policies and priorities that come with it. So Emeryville has the highest minimum wage in the nation, and that actually elevates socioeconomic opportunity for people, which, you know, further allows them to live closer to where they're working or where they go to school. So when we give people good paying jobs and we support them, we have a fair work week ordinance, which there was a recent study that just came out that had studied Emeryville's ordinance, similar to Seattle and San Francisco, which are other large cities that have this type of policy, where we actually require predictive scheduling for workers. We require that workers get the right to be paid additional wages if their schedules are changed within so many days in advance of what was posted. They have the right to get extra hours if they want them from the employer if people have to leave or cancel work obligations. And there was resistance to all these policies at first, but what we found through the study was that people were able to survive with fewer jobs. So lots of people were working 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs. Now, a lot of them have one job. They have more hours with that one job. So employers are actually focusing their time around those employees and not having them for 10 to 20 hours here or there. And we also found that parents were spending more time at home with their children, and they were reporting better family relationship and mental health and wellness outcomes. The city has a child care center. We're one of the handful of cities in California that has a city sponsored and run child care program. So we offer childcare to Emeryville families and employees who are in this town to make it affordable for people to come to work or live here and have childcare access. And those are just examples of a suite of supporting policies that we have. We also have a whole environmental program that's really focused on ensuring that there's sustainability between what we build in the city, and we're conscientious of our carbon footprint and the impact we have on the environment. So we've done everything from bird safe building design guidelines to we're installing I call it a giant washing machine for trash under one of our state highways to essentially separate trash out before it goes to the bay. So we're really focusing on hardening our infrastructure for climate resiliency and ensuring that we create healthy environments for our families.
Right. It's a whole suite of actions, and what you just touched on is probably just not even the half of it. But I love this about Emeryville having the highest minimum wage in the country. I wasn't aware of that, and
Mhm.
the positive impact that has, the ability to work less jobs, earn more at one, and then employers invest. That's really, really wonderful. Also, your city is one of the, I don't know if it's one of the few, but it is one of a minority that has free public transportation. When
That's
was this
correct.
rolled out?
We've had that for almost 20 years now.
Oh,
So yeah, I can't take credit for having created that idea, but we have a shuttle service called the Emeryville. It runs like a regular bus. There's 3 routes in the city. It's paid for by a parcel-based improvement district. So every property owner in the city pays a annual fee, which goes to a nonprofit board called the Emeryville Transportation Management Agency. And they run the schedules and the staffing and the fleet of buses. We have a brand new yard that we just opened for that. We're going to be moving to electrify. So we're going to turn over those shuttles into electric zero emission vehicle fleet. And it offers free service to anybody, whether you live here or not. It's ADA accessible and anybody can take it. It connects to major regional bus and Transbay bus lines, as well as to BART, which is our regional subway system. So it's designed to be a last mile solution. But right before the pandemic, the last really good stats we had in a 1.2 square mile city, 1,300,000 trips were taken in 2018 on that. So if you imagine that that's 1,300,000 fewer car trips through our community, that's how we are helping ensure that we have more people-oriented space.
So, yeah, so I was just going to ask, but maybe that answers it. Is there a democrat? Is there a truly democratic or a growing democratic use of PT? Public transportation is so stigmatized in so many communities, so kind of socially stigmatized. So, do you see an increasingly democratic use of public transportation across the city?
It's hard to read that right now because of COVID, and people have individual, very deeply held personal beliefs about being on transit, especially while some people it's due to mask mandates on transit. Other people, it's just due to proximity. Some people, it's due to working from home and other changes to their job and work structure. So it's really hard right now. I think it's a little too early to read where that is all going. I would just say that before the pandemic, we saw people were looking for ways to access transit better, and we partner with AC Transit, which is the bus transit agency over here in the East Bay. We partner with them really closely to ensure that we're providing infrastructure that's compatible with their vision for delivery of service. So everything from piloting transit islands. We have a plan to redesign one of our largest east-west corridors, 40th Street, which is currently a 5-lane car sewer. We're going to actually remove all the parking on 40th Street and turn it into a 2-way cycle track. And we're going to put pedestrian bulb outs and transit islands along it with transit priority lanes that are car free, so that the buses and the shuttles can move quickly between BART and jobs and shopping and other transit locuses. So our hope is that if we build it, they will come, as we say. If we build transit that's prioritized on corridors where it's supposed to be, that we will see more people leave their vehicle in exchange for something that's more functional. Yeah.
So all these initiatives that are coming, are a lot of them due to your? I mean, I'm assuming there's a team of people working on it, but are a lot of these due to your? You mentioned you're a true mobility nerd too, so I assume that this is coming out in the changes in the city. But are a lot of these due to your initiative, the changes coming?
Yeah, I don't want to take credit for anything by myself, because everything the city does is voted on by a council majority and
Hmm.
supported by our staff. And I wouldn't be, capable of doing these things without the support of them.
Right.
I do like to live in the wonky transit mobility space, as a nerd, as you noted. And
Hmm.
I sit on the transportation committee with my vice mayor, Ali Medina, and we work together on a lot of these ideas. So she has her own list of things. She's got San Pablo Avenue. I have 40th Street. We worked together on our Doyle Street program, which I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about a little. We've got a bunch of other smaller projects. She introduced a concept called Village Greens. I've introduced a couple street diets, and so we really work to pull our ideas together. She's really hyper focused on micromobility in particular, and I've been more of an infrastructure and financing kind of nerd. So we've been a really good complement, and our city council colleagues all support these things. They all believe in moving to a more active transit and mass transit oriented community. Emeryville was a very car gluttoned community, and still is in some ways, from years and years of development that was focused around regional shopping, which brought people here by car. And so we've really been trying to turn a very large ship around and change the way people access our city for the things that they do.
Okay, super interesting that as a regional shopping destination, and then understandable why many people are commuting there by cars. I grew up in Southern
Mhm.
California. I remember those regional shopping destinations. You didn't go by anything other than car, but all the changes you're initiating as a native Californian, I might end up in Emeryville myself if I move back to California. So I also thought the shuttle as a last mile solution is also so wonderful, and that free PT has been there for 20 years because that's really what's so desperately needed in so many communities, not just in the US, but including here in Europe, is the last mile solution for peripheral areas, suburbs, et cetera, where people are still super car dependent and options just don't exist. So that's really great. We had been talking about how you receive at Pedestrian Space in the future. I'm excited to start working with young students, high school students, but university students, and through our network, developing, pairing them with municipal leaders, et cetera. Um, in the mobility discussion and local actions. And you mentioned that you received dozens of requests from young folks interested in interning at your
Mhm.
office with mobility, which is essentially becomes a public. If they are taken in, they become public works intern. So I'm curious, what does a public works intern do?
Yeah, so I'm flattered and humbled by the number of people who actually reach out to me asking if I have an opening or a position. It's a very small city government. We have a very high quality, nimble staff for the size of a city that we are, and we have had internships over the years that are funded and managed through different programs that we access as well as the city. So like Civic Core or Civic Spark, elements of the AmeriCorps program. We've had positions over semesters for students that have come through. We've had them in the summer, so they've varied in the nature and style. But a person who joins us in that capacity at the Public Works Department usually gets their hand in a handful of things. Environmental programs in that department, which are often closely tied with active mobility in our city. Environmental programs are, but we are doing a lot of projects right now around mobility. So, I mean, I could talk about all of them. We're about to do a railroad quieting. So we got a grant to make pedestrian safe all 3 of our street grade railroad crossings, and we're going to go into construction on that later this year. And so we have a team of folks working on that. We have been doing this last year some design work around further enhancing our Emeryville Greenway, which is our bike ped separated corridor through the city, to do everything from raised crosswalks at street crossings to activated beacons that are activated by pedestrian movement, to pretty much anything you can think of. We're really looking for ways to do that. And so people who have joined our city staff in an internship capacity get their opportunity to kind of work in all of those spaces with us, depending on what's coming in front of the city at a given time.
Right. And the fact that I love that you say you're so flattered and humbled. To me, it seems like the fact that you're getting so much interest says one thing about, it's often young people, correct? Says one thing
It
about
is.
the young generation, which is so exciting. And they're really plugged into this mobility paradigm from a very like lived experience. We want walkable environments, we're not interested in working to earn up to save a car. We deserve these things and we're going to make it happen. So and they also recognize you as a leader in this realm and your vision, which I think also dialing into your social media streams so clearly conveys your vision with this. And so that's super exciting. Okay, yeah, let's get on Doyle Street. I asked earlier about open streets before we started recording. COVID brought us to the reality of all of these really amazing initiatives with open streets, or what was the other word for them?
Slow streets.
Slow streets, open streets and slow streets. So super exciting stuff from a mobility perspective. I want to hear about Doyle Street. What happened with Doyle Street?
Yeah, Doyle Street's a north-south street oriented through our city. It's got parallel routes on both sides, State Highway 123 or San Pablo Avenue, as most people here know it, and Hollis Street, which are heavily congested with vehicles and traffic lights. And Doyle Street runs essentially between a business side of the city and a residential side of the city. And at the north end of Doyle Street begins the fully separated Emeryville Greenway, which takes people up through the northern part of the city and connects to the 9th Street Bikeway in Berkeley. And on the south side of Doyle Street, there's the Greenway continues down at the south. And for about 7 blocks, the Greenway is on Doyle Street. And when we first had COVID, lots of people were understandably really nervous and apprehensive, and we were all told to stay at home. And in moments like that, I tend to look for the opportunities and things, and the sky cleared, literally. The sky was clean and everybody was at home and there weren't cars on the road. And we got a chance to observe what people were doing with their time outdoors. Where do people go when they can just be safe? There's no cars on the road. So without picking on any other city in particular, a lot of other cities came out with these real flashy things. We're going to do slow streets on this many miles. We're going to do this thing here and this thing here. And they had all these pilots and, everything from setting up A-frames to putting up signs saying this is a slow street. And you saw all kinds of bad behavior, people running them down, knocking them over, moving them. So people came to us and said, well, how come you haven't done something? They were all surprised. They're like, well, how come you haven't done something? But at Transportation Committee, the vice mayor and I were working very quietly with staff on developing something that we said from the beginning, we want this to be sustainable. Whatever we're going to do, we want it to be permanent. And so we don't want to do 5 or 6 streets in our city at one time if we can't make that all permanent. And what we really need to do is track both what is our long-term plan and the general plan for the city, and what are people doing. And what we saw is that people were walking the Greenway in the mornings while they were staying home. They needed to get stir crazy. They get out of the house. They're already walking, but more people were walking it. And they were walking down Doyle Street to the park, to the Doyle House Park. And there's a playground there, and there's a tot lot across the street, and the YMCA is on the other corner. And so we looked at it and we said, well, let's actually make this a COVID street. So we said, we're going to widen the pedestrian space all the way out into the street, remove the parking lane, remove the southbound traffic. This is a dedicated pedestrian space. And we put up full Jersey barriers so that things that couldn't just get knocked over. And people tried to move the water-filled Jersey barriers just to show you how much some drivers just didn't want those things on the street. And we would send the public works folks back out to realign them when they got moved. And we made it really clear that this was a pedestrian safe space, and people were using it in huge numbers. And so we had conversations with every business and resident who had a home or a property along Doyle Street about what our vision was. We said, this is something we were going to make permanent. We had people who didn't want us to do that. Oh, I'm going to lose the parking space across the street. Where will I park my car? Well, this is a public right of way, and people want and need spaces like this. And we're trying to give them safe connectivity between this existing facility up here on the north and these parks and playgrounds. And we think kids should be able to access that safely. So we devised a plan to close the northernmost block completely to traffic, and the block between the tot lot and the playground completely to traffic, which disincentivized any north-south movement for vehicles, because you could only go as far as 2 to 3 blocks north-south on Doyle Street before you had to take a turn and go all the way back over to one of the main roads. So there was a huge decrease in traffic volume on it. And then we separated the south side away, and or the southbound side away. We applied for grants. So I represent the city. I'm the chair of the Regional Transportation Commission. And I was the vice chair last year. And we applied for a grant to do a quick build. And we took some local transportation funding dollars we had, matched it with a regional grant. And within 12 months of COVID having begun, we had a fully operable, separated pedestrian space that's now permanent. And so cars are permanently off of southbound Doyle and its parking lanes. And you see lots of people biking and walking. I have people stop me on it when I'm on it and tell me that they taught their child to bike on one of the closed blocks. I have kids who scooter down the street now safely to the playground on their own. And when I see that, I literally just have a huge smile on my face when I go up and down Doyle Street, because it's that easy to make those things happen. And now, we're coming out of COVID, there's COVID fatigue, and most of these cities have given up on what they started with. And there's very little to show in terms of permanency across at least the United States. I can't speak for other places in the world, but there's a lack of permanency for these infrastructure improvements. And so people say, well, what did you do? What was special? How did you guys get it to go? It must be just because you're the mayor. No, it's because we chose to do something strategically from the beginning that was always intended to become a permanent fixture, because we saw the opportunity to use that moment to give people-oriented space, take it away from cars, and have people who are already adapting to COVID adapt to Doyle Street is not a car street anymore. That was another adaptation we asked our community to make, because they were already in an adaptation phase. And I think more local governments and leaders and advocates need to think strategically about how, when opportunities like that arise, and it won't always be a pandemic, obviously, God forbid it's a pandemic again, but like when we have opportunities like that, right? New development, construction, how do we leverage those things to actually create more people-oriented spaces? And we have several other examples of that around the city.
That's great. And I love how you adjust your whole mindset going into that, because it's true. And I think a lot of these initiatives were around the world, and I can actually relate, because I founded Pedestrian Space in, well, at least in social media, in the spring of 2020. So just as the pandemic was sort of rolling out across the world and places were locking down. And part of my interest was seeing all of these initiatives. I have a long-standing interest in walkable environments from a lived perspective, but to start documenting all of these initiatives, but also with the knowledge that, yeah, hopefully this pandemic doesn't last for years, and that people are going to get tired of talking about open streets. They're going to move on with their lives, right? Especially the general public who are not mobility nerds like you and I, and like many people that might linger on the pedestrian space website for a while. My interest is to really engage the public, because everybody needs to move through the city, right? And so I can really respect that you were looking at this, you and your team were looking at this even in the midst of the pandemic from a long-term sustainable perspective. And we're going to look forward to publishing. I know you mentioned you had pictures, so we'll look forward to publishing like a photo series at Pedestrian Space and sharing that later, because I think that sets a really good example, showing it's doable and you did it and it's permanent now. And that's how easy it is. Sometimes I feel like these initiatives get overlooked because they're almost so mundane. A pedestrian zone, when you move through it, it feels like just the way it should be. It's a walkable human scale space. It's just like every day, it feels like how it should be. And so it's not really flashy. And I feel like sometimes that's how in media it doesn't get the spotlight that it really should have, considering the car dominance we have across the planet today in urban and suburban areas. So it's wonderful. Yeah, I'll look forward to seeing pictures. I love seeing pictures. Oh, speaking of pictures, we were laughing earlier because we share something in common, that our phones are probably both full of infrastructure, public transport pictures, and city space pictures. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, just maybe share a little bit about that and how you weave that into your social media.
Yeah, so I'm, for better or worse, I'm a very transparent person, and I have a tendency of walking around the city with my dog and identifying opportunities, but all like, and just I have photos of, I'll walk out into the middle of an intersection when there's no vehicles, and I'll take photos of different dimensions of things, and I'll find spots where I'm like, well, the bike lane could go here. And I just have a whole library of photos of things I find. Also things I want changed. I had a post the other day. I was waiting for a bus, and I'm standing at the place where the bus would load. It's just past the intersection corner, and there's a couple other people there, and the bus door opens, and these kids walking up the street, and they tossed all their food trash into the bushes where the bus loading was. And I looked over, I let them go on ahead of me. And I looked over, and there was like cups and, chip bags and things all in the bushes on the grounds in this like kind of like 5-foot radius over by where the bus was loading. And I was like, huh. And I look back, and at where the rear of the bus is, there's a city trash can at the rear of the bus by the corner. And I'm sure that when it was designed, well, there's a corner here. So people are coming from these shopping areas in this way. This is a corner. But people are lazy, whether we like to say that or not.
Yeah.
And people weren't walking 25 feet back to the back of the bus area to put their trash there. So they were just tossing it, which isn't acceptable. But it's like, this is an infrastructure thing. So it's like, I took a couple photos, and I'm like, well, we clearly need to relocate the trash can, or we need a second trash can, right? So sometimes my photo taking is just observing as a user of the city myself. When you're in a car, you don't think of those things. You don't observe those things. But when you walk and bike your city all the time, right? Like there's entire sets of sidewalks where we have trees that have been growing for so long that we've cut the actual pavement width back to, because it was mounting the tree root. Like we've cut the widths of some of these sidewalks in some blocks back. We're like, no person with a stroller or in a wheelchair would be able to navigate that sidewalk. They'd be in the street. And when people see people in the street in the wheelchair, they're like, well, that person doesn't belong in the street. They don't, but they're there because you didn't build a city that works for them. Like that's the real problem, right? Like the city hasn't been built for them. So there's a whole video library, a photo library in my phone, which I think the city staff, they humor me at least, right? They have come to just accept that I think that this is who I am. And I show up with things. I'm like, that thing. Like, yeah. And when it's smaller, I've learned that when it's smaller fix, it's easier for me to just ask, can we fix that thing? Right? Like, let's do a common sense thing, like move this trash can, fix that street light. And the staff in the city are incredibly responsive and supportive of that. And then when there's like more structural and larger things, right? My thing is like, what do I need to do to get this into a plan or get a design done? And then tell me how much money it costs. And I have a reputation of going out and finding money to make infrastructure happen. That's what I like doing the most. I love going out and spending other agencies' money to build a more people-oriented city for my community.
That's great. And that's a skill, being able to find the money and get it granted to apply it to projects. I would come to a town hall meeting all about your photos and why you take them, because not everybody's on social media, right? And even if you are, there's so much, like how many accounts are we all following? But a town hall meeting that you go through pictures and say, this is why I took this picture, because I feel like that engages citizen awareness too. Because guess what? Everybody that's throwing stuff in the bushes, how many of them think, I could call the city, or I can email the city and ask them about, this reminds me of about a trash can. I was in a city recently where we were last living in Sweden, and out in the suburbs where there's a bus stop, and the same situation, there was no trash can by the bus, and it was just like littered, right? And of course that's
Mhm.
like disgusting, it's not pleasant to sit at a bus stop that is surrounded by litter. So I was like, this is a crisis, I must contact the municipality. And I did, and I was so happy to see, actually, I think it was like within a day or two, there was a trash
Yeah.
can there. And it's such a small thing, all these micro, but that can, on another point, for people for whom public transit isn't a choice, like they have to use it because they cannot
Mhm.
drive or they cannot afford a car.
Mhm.
For people who make the choice, out of whatever reason, it could affect their choice to use transit. Those small micro issues, if the bus stop is dirty, doesn't have shelter, they might eventually go back to a car if it's not only not, the bus could be convenient, but if it doesn't feel good, along the way. So it's super important.
But buses, safe, clean, reliable, and goes where I want to go. If it
Mhm.
doesn't do
Yeah,
those things, people don't want to use it.
people,
They
yeah,
make it, they make the reason, at least, for why they don't want to use it.
right. But
Yeah.
it's understandable if it's not if it
Sure.
doesn't feel safe, why would you use it? If it's not clean, yeah, you're risking your own like personal comfort and hygiene. So yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, you were at COP 26.
I was. I got to go to
Okay.
Scotland this past year. I was a member of the United States subdelegation to the UN Climate Change Conference.
Okay, first, how was Scotland?
I love Scotland.
Yeah.
I love Scotland. I've been
Yeah.
before, but I don't ever miss a chance if I can go to Scotland. And anyone watches this from Scotland, I love your country.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, and then how was the conference?
Oh, so many things I could say about that. The conference was really for me educational. There were definitely parts of it where I felt really demoralized, and there were parts of it where I felt really optimistic. So I'll start with the positive. On the optimistic side, youth presentations were what gave me hope. In fact, youth presenting and asking attendees, people like, I'm not even, among the older cohort of people who were there, but youth asking us to remain hopeful and optimistic. They're like, we need you to be optimistic. It was, for those of us who have been doing advocacy around climate action and environmental justice and making change, structurally and in the way we operate and moving away from fossil fuels in particular, it can feel exhausting. You do it for a long period of time, it can feel exhausting, like you're not making progress. But to see young people begging us basically to be optimistic and committed was a really positive thing. The other thing that was really positive, there was a large marionette, a life-size marionette named Little Amal, and she was created by a group of artists. She was like 12, 15 feet tall, and a human was inside her. And she was a symbol of a climate refugee, a young girl, which young girls are statistically the most likely to be displaced due to um, climate change in low-lying countries that are often countries that don't pollute. So it's industrialized countries that create all the pollution, and it's lower GDP, third world, southern hemisphere, tropical countries where people walk miles to get fresh water that are having their environment destroyed by the actions of more industrialized polluting nations. And so there was a march of the marionette from Syria to Scotland, and stopped in many places through Europe along the way, as I understand it. And I walked every day to the conference from my hotel, a couple miles. And I happened to walk along the shoreline one day of the River Clyde, and there were all these schools of kids dressed in different things. They had signs.
Mhm.
So I stopped and I asked one of the teachers, I said, what are these kids doing? And they told me that the kids were waiting for little Amal's arrival in Glasgow that morning. And so I actually forewent going to the conference that particular morning. And I asked to stay with the kids, and they let me
Yeah.
stay. And I interviewed them. I video interviewed the kids. They told me about what they wanted in the world, what they wanted the decision makers at the COP to know. And then little Amal came across the river, and these kids, you'd have thought they had seen a movie star. These kids went insane for little Amal.
Yeah.
And the marionette came and they sang and chanted together. And then there was a flag from each school. And the man in the marionette put it up on a giant flagpole he had with all these other school banners, these long thin banners, and then marched down, and the kids followed little them all, and they went down to the next school, and there was a whole river full of school kids from all over Scotland who'd come, and I just bawled my eyes out. It was like this was happening outside the conference, and you contrast that with when you go inside. And I sat the day before in one of the negotiation rooms for one of the subcommittees that was discussing part of the Glasgow Declaration's language. And I watched the United States and Canada and Switzerland resist language, oppose language that would have made our countries more accountable. And I had a lot of very conflicting feelings about our role in that. And then you got to the end of the 2-week conference and thought there was going to be essentially a negotiated deal to agree universally to ban the future use of coal. And then a couple large, still industrializing countries that are relying on coal, China and India in particular, we're like, no, we can't go as far as a ban. We'll agree to reduce our reliance. And you just realize we've not even gotten through coal. This is the 26th COP, and we haven't reached consensus about coal. Meanwhile, and the timeline that science is telling us about our future is so short, right? And you're just and you see these young people, and you just feel this immense level of consternation about what is keeping decision makers from taking action and being effective, and why aren't they listening to these children who have the cleanest answers? I was like, what do you want? And they're just like, we want people to make good decisions so that we have a planet too. It's like, can it get any simpler than that? And so for me, the takeaway for me is I'm unapologetic in what I do in my 1.5 square mile city. I don't apologize for putting active transportation, environmental justice policies, equitable housing and employment policies. I don't have any problem. I lose no sleep at night supporting those things. Why? Because this isn't really my planet, and this isn't my decision. It's my responsibility to do right by all the other people in this world and in my community. And so that really, that experience was eye-opening. Not that I didn't feel those things before, but the contrast and such of these global leaders in a refined, closed off space, making decisions, while outside there were people who just wanted to live their life in a safe and healthy space, was a real capstone for me about what I learned about how disconnected at times we are. There's many other lessons there. I had spent a lot of time with Indigenous people who shared a lot with me about how they are relegated to the back burner in these discussions, yet how their oral traditions and their histories of working with the land as keepers of the land really necessitate us finding a way to integrate them more intimately into the discussion about climate change. And then furthermore, there was almost no conversation about active transportation. So there was essentially large rallies outside the COP conference where everyone had signs that said this is a climate change machine, them riding bicycles around Scotland. And just the fact that there was all this discussion about goods movement and freight and ships, which are all important and huge sources of pollution, but there was no discussion about how we could innovate things like stop driving half a mile to go to the grocery store and walk or bike, and what could we do to just eliminate, just like the Emeryville does, eliminate millions of car trips that we don't need to take.
Right.
So
The
that
fact
was a
that
lot.
that's a lot. I appreciate it. I think you could talk for much longer. I'd love to host you again and have a talk entirely to COP26 along with pictures and everything, because I love hearing your reflections. And it is beyond absurd that walkability, public transit, and cycling were not on the agenda. This is almost like a farce at a climate change summit in 2022, when cities across the world are addressing, sustainable urban mobility plans, and many aren't. So how are we ever going to reach this, decade of change without addressing, our daily commuting behavior, which is such a huge part of it. So when I heard about that, I did think it was really, really strange. So I'm curious to learn more about how that got left off the agenda and how they're changing it for coming climate summits.
Yeah.
But also the disconnect. Why do you think there's such a disconnect? And these, as you say, behind the closed doors, the contrast of the global leaders and the closed respite. Do you think it's arrogant? What do you think it is? Why is there such a disconnect in what global leadership is often prioritizing or not prioritizing, and then contrasted with young people who understand and are asking for simply a clean future.
There's some hubris. There's definitely the belief that, well, I'm in this high powered position, so I'm here because I must know better. And that's the problem with most people in high levels of elected office, in my opinion, is they believe that the fact that they were elected to that position means people believe that they have all the answers. The truth is, you should be elected to those positions because you're the most likely to listen to people. And that is the thing that I sadly feel about a lot of people who are in high levels of office, is that they believe they were put there to just make decisions because they're omnipotent and omniscient. And I don't think that's a universal truth. I don't think that that's the case of everybody, but I do think that there are excuses made for why we have to give priority to other things, right? So while the whole global economy would stop if we made this change this quickly, right? There's some truth to that. There's truth that, like, when you've been doing something and you've designed an entire system and engineered an entire economy around GHG producing methods for transport, for example, you can't just flick the switch overnight and that happens. But we give lip service to developing the solutions. We keep talking about the problem. We keep sharing new data. We keep raising more flags. And the truth is that there are moneyed interests that keep decision makers in a place where progress to them is, well, I've given this concession, but the concession is not significant enough, or the change is not movement making enough to actually change behavior. I mean, I just look locally, for example, we have had very crazy wildfire seasons here in the Bay Area due to climate change, and more people are experiencing health consequences, losing their homes because of wildfires. The Bay Area has sat under smoke clouds for months, literally, in the past few years. And we have something called Spare the Air. I sit on the regional air board as the vice chair of the air district. Spare the Air days, and it's advising people to please take transportation this day and not use your car because there's an ozone impact and a GHG impact. But we don't see an actual meaningful change in the number of people who do it. And my criticism of the program has been, it's a great education campaign, but education without incentives isn't actually leading to behavior change, especially with transportation. Because we actually need to incentivize. We partner with the private sector to give them incentives to have people work remotely who can. There's different things that we can and should be doing. A lot of people will note the inequitable impact of some of those policies. Well, low-income people who have jobs as a janitor, for example, can't afford to not drive an hour from their home because they can't afford to live near the center of the city. This comes back to my earlier point with you, which was, this is why you need a comprehensive set of people-oriented policies. It can't just be, I want wider sidewalks or safer bike lanes. It has to be all the other pieces, or you aren't going to actually get behavior change. The positive news is that when people are introduced and do utilize different transportation modes successfully, transportation is one of the quickest things people are willing to change as a lifestyle habit once they realize they can do it safely and affordably. So what we need to do is actually create spaces and give people clean, reliable transit that's going to take them from A to B, give them safe spaces to walk or bike to school, because once they realize they can do that, they will do it. When we did Doyle Street, I had a resident at one of the HOAs I do a town hall at contact me and say, my wife used to drive our two kids to childcare every day. I decided to get a cargo bike and I put the kids on the cargo bike and I took them to childcare. The next day, my wife was to take them to childcare and they said, we don't want to go in the car, we want to go in the bike. She said, I don't feel like I can take you on the bike. I don't feel safe doing it. So her husband put them back on the bike and said, bike along with us. Biked the new Doyle Street pathway to the childcare center. Now the whole family bikes to childcare every day. They do not drive their kids to childcare. So if you actually give people choices, they will actually make better decisions. Cars are so expensive. Over the lifespan of a person, it's $700,000 to own a small car through insurance, maintenance, costs, repairs, payments, parking. Over the lifespan of a person, a small car, like, that's money taken away from their home ownership, from their education, from their child's opportunities, from earlier retirement, healthcare. Like, we don't actually help people see the financial impact of decisions that are both bad for them financially and socially, but also bad for the environment and safety. And so, like, we need to actually give people different choices, and that comes with making all these changes together.
Absolutely. And then I love that story because it shows within one household adaptation and then a little resistance on the mom's side, but then she joined on, and I can't imagine how good it feels. And I love that the kids instantly were like, we want to go in the car. It's so much fun, probably. Like the fresh
Yeah.
air, and you feel good. You're also getting exercise in. For me, I've lived in many types of environments, multiple car dependent, multiple walkable, and I love the walkable lifestyle because I feel fit. I walk for all my needs, and it actually has an impact on my physical, emotional, and mental health on a daily basis. There is a benefit that I feel. So there's another Doyle Street story you shared with me. I think it was before we started recording about the dad
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
who saw you ride
I
by.
was biking. I was biking with some friends down Doyle Street, and a guy yelled my name out at me, and I kind of hit the brakes, like who recognized me on a bike. I hit the brakes and I went back, and it was a guy who follows me on social media who I had never met. And he's like, "You're John Bauters," and I said, "I am." He's like, "You're the mayor." I said, "I am," and he said, he was talking to some other neighbors. There was a bunch of kids on scooters and stuff. And he said, the one block that we have closed between Ocean and 64th Street, he said, I just taught last 2 weeks, I just taught my kid to bike in that space. And he goes, and now our kids come down here to the park on their own. He's like, I just really love what you did. Thanks for doing this.
Mm,
So people, and it's funny because when you go, people are like, well, how did, it must just be in the water there. No, like people do show up at meetings and oppose us removing parking. I get emails about people who are angry about removing parking. The thing is, the people who have the time, who want the convenience of parking, they have time because they have convenience is their priority, if you think about it. But like the mom and dad who are busy like with taking one kid to soccer practice and the other kid to judo, right, or like going and spending their afternoon at the petting zoo or whatever they're doing with their kids, okay, doesn't have time to come to the council meeting. They're
right,
feeding or putting their kids to bed, right? And I
right,
recognize that. And so you have to, as an elected, rather than wait to see who shows up at the town hall, right? And it's like, well, there's 20 people here who are all got pitchforks and they're mad about losing these 7 parking spaces on this block. No, it's like I go out and I meet all the people who are like, this is awesome. We love this
right,
thing. So
right,
I'm not like the loudest voice in the room isn't going to steer me from my values or the confidence I have, knowing that people want that. People want that. And I tell people that in the public meeting, this is what people want actually. And so
right.
we're going to do it. It's healthier for them and it's safer for all of us. Yeah.
Yeah. I so commend you. And it's true. A lot of the moderate voices or the people who are sort of on the fence, they could be like reluctant drivers, reluctant passengers, and they're just too busy. And a lot of the moderate voices are probably at home. And when they see that there's an option, they're like, oh, and they're excited. So that's great. I'm going to be so excited to do more coverage with you. Let's wrap this up with what we call a city walkability rating, where we address you score the walkability, public transit, and cycle friendliness of your city on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is the lowest, 10 is the highest. So these are meant to be like, their scores, their numbers, but it's more about the story behind the score. And then also
Mhm.
maybe at some point circling back with you to see if your score changed, or sharing the video with other residents, friends in Emeryville, and like saying, what would your score be? So I'm going to let you choose what you want to start with
I'll
rating.
start with public transportation because that's our high point. I always try to start
Okay.
with the positive.
Okay.
The high point would be public transportation. I would give us probably an 8.5 to a 9 on public transportation. The reason being is we have a Amtrak station. So we are connected to both regional and national rail that way. And so people take commute trains to jobs and things here in the city and can go regionally on the Amtrak train. We have a really robust bus network. And so that AC Transit, we have multiple Transbay bus lines that take people across the Bay Bridge to San Francisco. We have regional lines that take people, San Pablo has Rapid Line that takes people all the way to downtown Oakland, all the way out to the county border. And then we have a lot of local lines as well. And those are highly reliable services. And Emeryville is very lucky because in our partnership with AC Transit, almost all of our buses are hydrogen fuel buses. And so we have zero emission fleet working in our city. So on that part, I think that's also positive. And then last, we have the Emery-Go-Round. Well, we have 2 things left. The Emery-Go-Round, which is a free shuttle service. So we have one of the only free transit systems in the country. And that takes people to BART. It connects people to AC Transit buses. It connects them to the Amtrak station. It takes them to shopping, jobs, residential neighborhoods. And it's free and people ride it all the time and they love it. And so we have that as a reliable service. And then last, we have a program called 8 to Go, which is an on-call $1 fare for any person who is a senior or has a mobility limitation, is of any age, who wants a personalized shuttle pickup to take them to either a regional medical center or a transit hub or certain destinations within our zip code. And that is available. And we have about 300 seniors and people living with disabilities in our community who rely on that service. And we use grant money to fund that, to make that accessible to them at any time that they need it. So I would say we do very well on public transportation. I would say that the places where we could improve, why is it not a 10, is bus stops. I think bus stops, we need to have more benches at bus stops so that people who need to rest can do that. Bus stops need to be cleaner. And those are kind of my only criticisms of the public transit system in Emeryville. Cleaner bus stops with more benches. And our Commission on Aging has actually recommended to us benches. And so I'm hoping that in the future we'll have additional funds available to put benches at all stops in our city. So that's my public transit report.
Ooh, awesome. Wait, one second. The service for people, seniors and those with disabilities, what was it called?
It's called 8 to Go. The number 8. Yep, 8 to Go.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's what we call it. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, so what's next? Walkability or cycling?
Cycling. Cycling is next, and cycling, I would give us a 6, but we are moving up from what I would say was probably a 2 or a 3. So this is the place where I think we're making the most. I think we've done public transit well for a while. I think cycling is where we're making the fastest and most significant improvements. So we have the Greenway, which goes from the very northeast corner of our city to the southwest corner of our city. The last quarter of the Greenway will be completed next year. So the full Greenway, you'll be able to traverse Emeryville on a full bicycle path by the end of next year. With that included that section on Doyle Street, which we hardened and improved for bicycle and pedestrian safety. We just opened in December our South Bayfront Bridge, which is a bike ped bridge that takes people across the Union Pacific Railroad track without requiring them to go on any of our heavily corridored car roads. So people have a carless path across the tracks. We have our 40th Street plan, which we received our first pot of money for. We received almost $5 million of grant money to start construction on our 40th Street redesign, which has a separated cycle track. We're actively looking for the last 11 million right now. And we are poised to adopt a plan on San Pablo Avenue to remove all the parking on both sides of San Pablo Avenue and put protected cycle lanes on a state highway. It would be one of the first such projects in the state to do that. So we've got that going. And then we have a new bicycle pedestrian overcrossing that's a couple years out to cross the freeway and connect to the Bay Trail that will go in, and that will come down to Lacoste Street, which we just adopted in our new active transportation plan as a road diet idea. So we're going to actually eliminate an entire street and turn it into a bike ped trail. So I would say we are up and coming, and I'm really hoping that the full network of Emeryville projects will be built out. One I'm really excited about that's out my back door. We have an existing building that is being renovated as part of a residential project. And we have an east-west bike path on 45th Street that dead ends into this project. And we required the developer to blow a hole through the entire building to actually have the bike path pass through the building and into a new park that's being built. So we are innovating creatively to give bike connection to all of the parks and civic spaces in the city. So I would say we're a 6, and my hope is that in 5 years, if you were to talk to me, we would be a 9.
Okay. Exciting. Okay, so rounding off on walkability.
We get a 3. We get a 3 on walkability, and that is in part due to things that are kind of pre-existing and are really hard to control. So the city was an industrial town for the first century of its existence, and buildings, really large warehouse style buildings, were built all the way up to rights of way. That's the way it was done before streets were paved and there were sidewalks and gutters. So the sidewalks that exist through most of the city are extremely narrow. And there isn't really space to widen them. So when we think of complete streets, there are some major roads where people would walk, I think, more regularly, but the walking conditions are not favorable because the distance between the curb and the side of a building is less than 6 feet in many places. And that's not really make it passable through some of our corridors in the city. And that I don't get to give us a pass on walkability just because it is the way it is. I think other things that were done for years, there was kind of this desire prior to my time on council to just let developers build things all the way up to lot lines with very little regard for street trees or street sidewalk infrastructure. We've been adding bulb outs and other things. In fact, there's a block from my house where there are no sidewalks. So when I think about it, yeah, there's 2 streets in the city that have no sidewalks at all. So there, even in an urban setting, we have work to do. What we have done is with our planning regulations, there's a lot of redevelopment of stuff. We have now complete street plans in our planning regulations, and we do require the undergrounding of utilities to remove utility poles from the middle of sidewalks where, like, I don't know how a lady with a stroller or a man in a wheelchair was to get around those things. We have requirements to underground utilities, to widen sidewalks, to do other things, bioswales to collect rainwater for filtration. We do have a whole plan now, and so those things do happen, but they're on a block by block basis, which is far less than ideal. So I would say we get a 3 on walkability. The irony of it is that we are very close to being a 15-minute city, meaning that you could walk to any park or playground or any civic space restaurant within 15 minutes. We're almost completely at that place. So it's not that we're not walkable. It's just that I don't think the infrastructure reflects our vision for ourselves.
Okay, let's round off on this note because I find it really interesting that you brought that up, because I'm here in Europe, and when I first heard about the 15-minute city, I was living in Sweden in a smaller city that I would say was a textbook example of a 15-minute city. So such cities exist around the
They
planet, I
do.
think,
Mhm.
and also the DNA is there in a lot of existing cities if we make changes. So I think it's really interesting. You are a small city. I think it could be really interesting to end on this note. I love that you brought it up, that you are, the irony being that you are almost can function as a 15-minute city. So if walkability is enhanced over the coming years, you have a pretty rich local example of being a 15-minute city.
Mhm. Yeah,
I know.
I really think like being a 15-minute city doesn't just mean everything is within 15 minutes. It means, will people actually walk between A and
Right,
B, right?
right. Is it pleasant? Is it safe?
Is it
Is it convenient? Exactly. Do
right?
people enjoy
Do they
moving?
enjoy it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to address this too. I know there is some concern uh, in the North American framework too, sometimes, that you make things enhanced and walkable, and it's not always socially equitable, maybe, or that it's like development, like it is in a sense. If I think among some real estate developers, it's kind of like a characteristic that is compelling for people. We're developing a walkable environment, but at the Emeryville level, I mean, really, the size of it too, what you have there is a city that with changes can function as an example of a very healthy 15-minute city. So what would your vision be if somebody asked, John, we're going to ramp it up, and let's, as a team, we're working towards making this a true 15-minute city over the next several years. What would your ideas for walkability be? I think you've already listed some, but
Yeah, I think the thing that I've tried to impress, that I know my colleague on the transportation committee has agreed with, is we talk about networks, bike and pedestrian networks, but then we do like segments, and they're not really connected. They look like fragments as opposed to networks. So I think it's really about like looking at the plan, having a cohesive plan, which we have, and then actually fulfilling the vision for that network first. Like, okay, how do we close all these gaps so that people can connect to in any direction they want on something that is like, I may not be able to change every street, but I should have a path and a plan to move people to all the parts of the city on some corridor that is safe and pleasant and quick and enjoyable for them. And so I think that building out that network is key. And what we've done is we've tied that network to all the things that we know people like to use in the city. So we have several very popular parks, right? So necessarily all the bike and ped networks need to connect between those places, right? They need to connect to regional things like the Bay Trail and this new 40th Street plan. So like our vision is start with kind of the high level skeletal frame of that, right? And give people something that is fully safe to move through the city on a safe path. And then from there, you can kind of build in all the other bones and the details of that as you go. But I would say that if I had a goal, it would be to finish that high level framework first so that there is something that people can rely on across the city.
that's really, yeah, that's great. I want to share an anecdotal experience from also that last city I lived in, because it relates to what you just said. It was I consider it a 15-minute city in many respects. The access to green space, all amenities, etc., quality of life, wanting to move by foot, but also that skeletal frame. And often from the ground, that skeletal frame, it's not razzle dazzle. It's like it's super boring. It's a path. It's a cycle path and a bike and a walking path. And it's I would go on my walks and I would go to different suburbs, or I'd ask people in different areas of city, because I lived in the center of the city. So it's like, what does my opinion matter as a person living in the heart of the city? Of course, I can reach everything quick. What about people in the various suburbs? So I would ask people in the various suburbs, like, can you reach everything in 15 minutes? So they think like they don't think about this. People, the average citizen isn't contemplating whether their city's a 15-minute city too, right? And they say, yeah, actually I can. Yeah, within 15 to 20 minutes, I can do everything by bike and foot. And all of the infrastructure was there. This, as you put it, the skeletal frame was there. And it's not anything that you would like take a second glance at. It's just functioning, clean, safe pathways, you
But
know?
I will say something that's unique to our city is known as the city of artists.
Oh,
And so one of the things we've done is we have a very robust art and public places program,
okay.
and along our pedestrian corridors, the ones that we've really highlighted, the Greenway in particular, we have begun a mural program. So large buildings that are along these, we have several murals now that depict different parts of our city, different images and themes. So we have an area at Palo Park. We opened, it's a segment of our pedestrian greenway in 2018, and it had Joey Rose did a large mural, which is all the native insects and butterflies of the region, along this back of a bar that fronts the greenway. So you have this really interesting space to think, and you kind of can go through the city, and there are now a handful of these, and we're actively every year we fund a mural to be added somewhere, and we're really active in putting art along these spaces, because it does give people that really pleasant experience of and thoughtful space to move. And again, it's about creating joy, right? We're back at the first question. It's about creating
Great.
joy.
That's a great place to close off. But we also do love to feature art at Pedestrian Space. So I'll be following up with you on that, because I would love to see
Yeah, I'll
images
send
of
you some
that.
photos of that. Yeah, I'll
Right.
send you
City,
photos.
really quick. Why is Emeryville known as the city of artists?
So a long time ago, when Emeryville was kind of wrapping up its experience as an industrial town, artists started squatting in old warehouses and buildings. In fact, there's a building about a block from here that the city purchased in the late 70s. The artists were squatting in, and they had it retrofitted with a sprinkler system, and the artists turned it into a bunch of they put up their own walls and barriers between it, and it's a cooperative building, and so it's an existing affordable housing. So they pay a small fee to live there, and they lease the building from the city for $1 a year. So we have naturally occurring artist housing throughout the community, and we've prioritized that since. So I think we have more artists per capita than most cities in California, and we're one of 12 cultural art designated districts by the California Art Council.
Hey, wow, that's a whole nother. Gosh, there's so much
Dimension.
going on there. Another dimension. Yeah. As I mentioned, I've been to Emeryville in 2018, and I really hope to revisit again. Your enthusiasm is contagious. Thank you so much for taking the time. Emeryville is so lucky to have you. I love hearing about your role as mayor, everything that's happening on the ground there. So thank you.
Thanks, Annika, for having me. I really appreciated this discussion, and I'm grateful to you and everyone else who does advocacy and organization around pedestrian and mobility issues, because we need more people like you.
Great. And we're going to look forward to interviewing you some more in the future too. Okay. There's a lot to unpack with you. So I look forward to more talks.
Sounds good.